My name is Valérie André, and I will be teaching today's class, as well as lectures number 10 and number 12. Today's lecture will be about industrial relations in Britain in the 20th century. I will be taking you through a sort of short history of the trade union movement and organized labor from the 1920s to the 1980s, with a specific focus on the general strike of 1926. So to the question, why should we study the general strike of 1926? Why should we choose to focus on an event which took place almost 100 years ago? One possible answer would be that the general strike of 1926 can be considered as a founding moment in the history of British trade unionism. And we will try to identify and assess its significance. It's also because the general strike of 1926 encapsulates many of the features of future industrial disputes, and it's also a way perhaps to try and understand what the main features of industrial disputes are. So it's a sort of an attempt to try and showcase those outstanding features. And in that respect, of course, we will be interested in the legacy of the general strike of 1926, or perhaps in the legacies, in the plural, of the general strike. It's also particularly interesting to look back to the general strike of 1926 because one could argue that it has achieved a quasi-mythical status for some sections of the British left in Britain, especially those who take a particular interest in what can be described as direct action. In other words, those occasions when working people, or perhaps when the people, between inverted commas, will stand up for their own interests. It has a highly romantic potential as well, and this is something that you can see for yourselves if you decide that you can spare 2 hours and watch this BBC television drama entitled Days of Hope by British filmmaker Ken Loach, which was released in 1975 at a time of renewed union militancy. And you can simply go on Amitis, click on the link, and watch Days of Hope to understand, of course, what I mean by romantic potential. The last point which I want to make in this short introduction, in defense, of course, of the decision to study the general strike of 1926, is that it also raises a number of interesting questions which have to do with the role of the media, the independence of the media in such circumstances of great social tension, and in particular, of course, when a major strike is taking place. So there is also a lot to be said about news reporting, how media outlets report events, and in this particular case, in the case of the 1926 strike. We will also be interested in the role of the British Broadcasting Corporation, also known as the BBC, which was confronted at the time of the strike with a first major event that it had to provide coverage for. It's interesting because as citizens, of course, ourselves, all of us, we have to try and decide, or perhaps try and understand, how we forge an opinion about a particular event in the news, especially today when we live in a news-saturated environment with news coming from all sorts of media. So it's also an exercise in media literacy. So let us turn to the first slide on your PowerPoint. And this first slide is concerned with the major facts that can be gathered, the essential facts that we can, use as a sort of starting point. The first fact about the general strike of 1926 is that it was a very short-lived event. It only lasted 9 days in May 1926. But of course, the fact that it was such a brief moment in time does not imply that it didn't have a lasting legacy. So it's interesting perhaps to, confront this very short period of time with the lasting legacy of the strike itself into the 20th century. Second point is that this strike was called by the TUC. So I'll have to explain what I mean by TUC. Perhaps you already know if this was mentioned in the 19th century class. TUC is short for Trade Unions Congress. And the Trade Union Congress was a federation of trade unions which was founded in 1868. From 1868 onwards, the TUC gathered momentum. It became more important. It tried to promote the idea of concerted action. It tried to promote the idea that trade unions would be more powerful together if they joined forces, if they stood united. And the idea, of course, was to try and find a sort of antidote to one of the major weaknesses of trade unionism in the 19th century, namely that it was a fragmented movement. So the idea was to bring unity to the trade union movement and to bring together the various branches of industry in one federation, the Trade Unions Congress. So this strike was called by the Trade Unions Congress, and many workers decided that they would fight alongside the miners, who were the first, of course, to be involved in strike action and industrial dispute. The miners were those who had a quarrel with their employers, who had a quarrel with the mine owners over wages, over working hours. The call by the TUC was a fairly successful one because over 3 million workers went on strike in support of the miners in a wide range of industrial sectors, as you can see on slide number 2. And it can therefore be argued that it was not only a strike which involved the miners. last point which I want to make is that in this short period of time, a few days, 9 days, in May 1926, violence erupted in Britain, in many places, in Scotland, in the north of England, in London, and especially over the government's decision to use volunteers to try and undermine the strike. 9,000 people were arrested during the strike. So to conclude on this first slide, what we can say is that this was a strike which did not only involve the two sides of industry, on the one hand the employers, the factory owners, on the other hand the workers, but that there were also other protagonists in this story. The other protagonists were the British government, a conservative government at the time, with a prime minister whose name was Mr. Baldwin, and also Britain's population, who were involved in the strike, not as supporters of the strike, but as people who volunteered to take the workers' place so that the strike would not have a negative impact on the nation's economy or on the population's living conditions. So many protagonists, not only workers and employers, but also government and the population at large. So if we want to try and understand why this strike was called by the TUC, we have to go through a number of causes, and we'll start with the short-term causes. The circumstances of the early 1920s in the immediate post-war period. The immediate post-war period, after the war ended in 1918, was a difficult period from an economic and social point of view. First of all, because it was difficult to organize a transition to a peacetime economy. Soldiers were demobilized, they had to find work, the economy was disorganized, in particular because the United Kingdom had lost markets, export markets during the war, when its economy was concentrating on fighting the war. So difficult transition to peacetime. Also, another important element that needs to be taken into account here is the reintroduction of the gold standard, in French, the étalon or, gold standard or étalon or in French. So what is the gold standard? The gold standard is a decision taken, it was a decision taken by the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Conservative government to tie the money supply. Money supply is a term which refers to the quantity of money which circulates, the quantity of sterling which circulates. The French for money supply is masse monétaire. So the gold standard is when it is decided that the money supply will be tied to the country's gold reserves, would be tied to the country's stock of gold. Okay? Well, what this means in practice, it's an important decision with far-reaching consequences. What this meant in practice, well, then, of course, the government announced that they would not be printing money, that they would not have recourse to inflation in order to stimulate growth through increased demand. In other words, that they would not try to kickstart the economy again through inflation, through increased wages, through increased incomes for the population. Because this meant, of course, not respecting the need to index or to fix the money supply to the country's gold reserves. So this was a new financial orthodoxy. The priority was to try and maintain the value of sterling, the value of the national currency, even if this meant not being able to kickstart the economy again through a management of demand. This decision was taken at a time when the British economy was in a slump, when a recession had set in, at a time when many promises had been made to the British population, and especially to those who'd fought during the war, those young men who had served their country, defended their country in wartime, and who, once they had been demobilized, had been told and promised by the government in 1918, 1919, that the government would reward their contribution to the war effort. And one promise which had been made would be that every soldier's family would have a roof over their head. This is the famous phrase that they would have access to homes fit for heroes. So my point here is that there was a lot of expectation on the part of ordinary people who had contributed to the war effort. Some had paid with their lives, and who'd been promised, or their families had been promised, major investments, in particular in housing. And all of this, of course, all those promises were somehow incompatible with the new focus on the necessity to go back to the gold standard and maintain the value of the pound. Investing in housing policies implied at the time that the state would have to print new money, would have to have recourse to inflationist policies so that it could finance an ambitious social policy. Okay? So instead of prioritizing social policies, the return to the gold standard meant that what was being prioritized was the value of Britain's currency, the pound sterling. Okay? So it's easy to understand, of course, that this could generate frustration for many people in Britain, especially those who belonged to the poorest sections of the population. If we turn to the political causes, which can also be analysed and explored if we want to understand the short-term causes of the general strike, we have to bear in mind that the political situation in Britain in the early 1920s, from the early 1920s onwards, was a polarized political situation and context. First of all, because the Conservative Party was in power from 1922 onwards, and that there was this general feeling, of course, that the Conservatives, once in power, would be more likely to support the industrialists, in case of an industrial dispute, that they would be more inclined, of course, to support the interests of employers and property owners, that they would be inclined to defend the interests of the working population and wage earners. So this is the first point about political polarization. But there were other, of course, reasons why it is possible to speak of a polarization of the political context, the political situation. If we turn, for instance, to the importance of political radicalism and increased political radicalism in Britain from the early 1920s onwards. One example would be to mention the creation and the development of the CPGB, the Communist Party of Great Britain, CPGB, which was founded following working class militancy in wartime in the north of England and in the Clydeside region just south of Glasgow, but also following, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia of 1970s. So there was also radicalization, we could say, on the left, with the CPGB gaining momentum and representing some kind of threat. It was seen as some kind of threat by the conservatives, of course, by those who were on the right of the political spectrum, but also tensions erupted, tensions emerged on the left between those within the left wing movement, a tension and sometimes also conflicts or conflicting views between those who were in favor of a more parliamentary approach to politics. So in other words, what I mean by parliamentary approach is when trying to achieve reforms, to achieve goals through parliamentary legislation. Tension between those who were in favor of parliamentarism and those who were tempted to accept the views of the CPGB that real reform could only occur through revolution. So there were tensions between left and right, but there were also tensions within the left, in Labour ranks. Okay. Last short-term cause on this third slide, and it has to do, of course, with the emergence and development of what is generally described as organized labor. When workers organize in trade unions, and everything that I've said so far about the trade union council gaining momentum, okay, is also relevant here. You have to realize that the Trade Unions Congress wanted to be able to represent the whole of Britain's working population. And as such, the TUC needed to be able to demonstrate that they could stand up for workers' rights. So this is a last point which needs to be taken into account when we look at the short-term causes which can explain the 1926 general strike against a highly polarized background. So let us turn to slide 4, which is concerned with what I've described as longer term causes. I want to talk about union militancy in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. I want to talk about what has been described as the great forward march of labour, the great forward march of the labour movement. And the main point which I want to make here is that there were those in 1925, 1926 in the labour movement who felt that it was time to pick up the threads of a history of union militancy which had been interrupted by the First World War, when the trade unions agreed that they would prioritize the national interests over working class interests. So this is an important point. At the time when the First World War broke out, the trade unions were faced with a choice. They could either say, we're not interested in fighting the First World War, this is a nationalist war. We do not feel that this is a war which will in any way concern our interests as working people. Or they could accept to prioritize the defense of the realm, defense of the national interests, which is what they did. But there was, this was a decision which was made after a fairly protracted debate took place within the working class movement. So you will find on this slide number 4, some information, the most essential information concerning the major events which took place in the Edwardian period between 1901 and 1914, as far as industrial relations were concerned. The first point concerns a growing union membership. The number of unionized workers increased greatly in a very spectacular way between 1901 and 1913. You can find the exact figures on the slide. What also happened in the trade union movement is that the trade union movement witnessed the emergence of new players with a different conception of what trade unionism should achieve and how it should be achieved. One example of those new players is taken here. You can see a photograph of Tom Mann and a short text that I've reproduced on the slide. Tom Mann, who was a syndicalist leader, perhaps the greatest syndicalist leader in the 1890s and in the first decade of the 20th century. Now, syndicalist is un faux ami. It doesn't mean syndicaliste in French, but it means syndicalisme révolutionnaire ou partisan d'un syndicalisme révolutionnaire. People who believed that the workers' movement should be about overthrowing the capitalist system of production. It was very much concerned with this priority that should be given to fighting a war against the capitalist system of production. So this was the goal: overthrowing, toppling, bringing capitalism to its knees. And obviously, there was also, where syndicalist leaders were concerned, this belief that this could only be achieved through a final confrontation with capitalist owners and with all those who represented and tried to defend capitalism. So it was a much more, I would say, aggressive type of trade unionism. And this is why, of course, it was called syndicalism and not trade unionism. So you have to make a distinction between the two. So new players with the new syndicalist leaders, and also those who, in Britain's factories, were convinced, or at least attracted to, the various points which were made by the syndicalists and the new orientations which the syndicalist leaders were trying to give to the trade union movement. Those people who, in Britain's factories, were attracted to those theories of syndicalism were to be found among the shop stewards. The shop stewards were those ordinary workers who were to be found on the shop floor, c'est-à-dire des gens qui se trouvaient dans les ateliers. Shop floor, c'est l'atelier. So not the trade unionists of the TUC, not the leadership of the trade unions movement, but those at the bottom, those who could also be described as the rank and file, and who were sympathetic to the ideas of syndicalist leaders. The last point which I want to make in this fourth slide has to do with a number of events, a succession of events which took place between 1901 and the outbreak of the First World War, with a number of disputes taking place between workers and owners, which were resolved in such a way as to threaten hard-won rights which had been won by trade unionists in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century, and which were gradually put into question and threatened by a number of decisions. So one important decision which you have to be aware of is known as the Taff Vale judgment. So this judgment, and the word is interesting because what you must realize, of course, is that it was a judgment given by the courts, by the judiciary, by the law. Okay? So this judgment in the dispute between railway workers and railway owners was a judgment which ruled that a trade union could be held responsible for the damages caused during a strike. Damages translates into French as dommages et intérêts. What this meant in practice was that any damage, not damages, but damage, any damage done during a strike, any losses in terms of productivity and in terms of profitability, any losses incurred by the employers would have to be paid back by the trade union. So this was, of course, a very important judgment which, if it did not officially declare strike action illegal, in practice made strikes impossible because the trade unions and the trade unionists would have to pay for the right to go on strike. And of course, there are limits to how many strikes and how many strikes a trade union can finance and how long the strike can be. So this was a decision which threatened the right to go on strike, if indirectly, but it was a major threat. This was nullified in 1906, but the judgment came in 1901, and it was obvious that it was a judgment which benefited the owners and was detrimental to the workers. So therefore, there was, we could say, on the part of working people, a certain distrust in the judiciary. Second interesting judgment, the Osborne judgment, which came in 1909, and this judgment introduced a system which is known as contracting in. So I'm going to explain what this means. To contract in is a term which applies to the decision taken by a trade unionist to pay a political levy to finance the Labour Party. The Labour Party, which was formed in 1906 and which gradually, progressively, from 1906 onwards, was the party which represented the interests of working people, the interests of labour in Parliament. So what the Osborne judgment did was to introduce a system whereby every worker had to declare when it joined a trade union, every worker had to declare officially that they would also support the Labour Party financially. This is known as contracting in. The system which existed before 1909 was known as contracting out. And in the previous system, the political levy, in other words, taking a percentage of the fees paid by the trade unionists in order to join the trade union, the political levy was automatic. The trade unionist didn't have to say anything to anyone. Automatically, a proportion of the fees paid would be used to finance the Labour Party. So my point here is that the Osborne judgment was a system which tried to limit the powers of the Labour Party by limiting the finances of the Labour Party. And at the same time, it could also be argued that it was a judgment which tried to break the link between the trade union movement, and the political representatives of working people in the Labour Party. This was also a judgment which alienated trade unionists and alienated a vast majority of working people who were extremely frustrated and critical of the Osborne judgment. So all of this, what I've mentioned before, the new players, the Taff Vale judgment, the Osborne judgment, all of this created circumstances which were, in fact, appropriate for the emergence of trade union militancy between 1910 and 1914. In this period, known as the Great Labour Unrest, with a succession of strikes, with the formation of the Triple Alliance or Triple Industrial Alliance with the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, the National Union of Railwaymen, the Transport and General Workers, coming together in something which could be described as the first stage, the first step towards a national strike. Trade union, solidarity, Triple Industrial Alliance, this could be seen, and it was seen at the time, as possibly the first step towards a general strike, the first step towards this revolution which the syndicalist leaders were hoping would finally take place in Britain. So all of this great union activity, union militancy, all of this was interrupted with the outbreak of war, when the trade unions finally decided that they would put country before their own self-interests as working people, as workers. Okay? But at the same time, it can be argued that in the post-war period, there were those who hoped that the new, in the aftermath of war, this movement would be resumed and that it would be successful this time. So this is what we can say about the longer term causes of the 1926 general strike. I will now move to what I've identified as the trigger, and this you will find on the fifth slide in your PowerPoints. So the trigger, le déclencheur, la gâchette, ce qui a mis le feu aux poudres, the trigger. The trigger had to do with attempts to reorganize the mining industry in Britain after the war. The first decision in this attempt to reorganize the mining industry after the war was a decision taken by the Prime Minister at the time. His name was David Lloyd George, and he decided that the mines should be returned to private owners. The mining industry had been nationalized in wartime because in wartime it had been decided that a nationalization of the mining industry would make the industry more efficient. Okay, that decisions concerning output and production should be made by the state, should be made by the government. So there was this sort of belief in efficiency and how efficiency could only be reached through nationalizations. Once the war was over, there were those who believed that this meant returning to normal, and normal meant privatizing the coal industry, returning the mines to private owners. Now, this decision was taken in a difficult context, in unfavorable circumstances. I've already mentioned the return to the gold standard, which made British exports, and in particular British coal exports, more expensive. If the value of sterling is high, exporting British coal was, of course, more expensive for those who bought it. Okay? And coal, British coal, was more expensive because of the high value of sterling, the high value of the pound. It was also more expensive because in the early 1920s, a number of foreign competitors emerged. British coal had to face competition from Polish coal, coal produced in Poland. British coal had to face competition from coal produced in Germany, whose coal industry was more efficient because it had been modernized, where the British mining industry had not been modernized, had not been mechanized. So it was more expensive to produce coal in Britain than it was to produce coal in Poland or in Germany. And lastly, if we're talking about foreign competition, the Dawes Plan was passed in 1924, whereby Germany would pay reparations to France following the war and the ratification of the peace settlement through the Treaty of Versailles. That Germany would have to pay, and that Germany would pay through coal deliveries to France, which meant that Britain was losing an export market. The French no longer needed to buy British coal because their needs, as far as coal is concerned, would be, of course, met by German coal deliveries. Okay? So this is broadly the context in the few years which preceded the outbreak of the strike. Tensions erupted, and there was an escalation of the conflict between the private owners, the private mine owners, and the Miners' Federation of Great Britain. The Miners' Federation of Great Britain, we understand, was the trade union which represented those who worked in the mines, the MFJB. The conflict was a conflict over wages. The workers in the recession of the post-war period were, of course, asking for higher wages, whereas the mine owners, who had become responsible for the mines, wanted to increase their profits in adverse circumstances where coal exports were falling. So dividing or diverging interests, the mine owners wanting to increase profitability, the mine workers wanting to increase wages, and the mine owners saying, well, if we're not selling our coal, if our coal is too expensive, that is because our wages are too high. So putting the blame on mine workers for the high cost of British coal. So polarization, conflict, intransigence on both sides, with working people not wanting to give in, the miners themselves not wanting to give in, standing firm, asking for higher wages, which the mine owners, of course, refused to give them. So this is when the government tried to step in and to try and arbitrate. There was a deadlock. The situation had come to the confrontation between mine owners and mine workers had come to a deadlock. And in order to try and find a solution, the government was involved and asked for a commission of inquiry, which delivered a report in March 1926, the Samuel Report. The Samuel Report declared that the mine owners had a case, and that in fact, in order to boost coal exports, British coal exports, the workers' wages had to be cut. The average cut was of 13.5%. Okay, and at the same time, it was decided in this report that the government subsidies to the mine owners should come to an end. This decision, the publication of the Samuel Report, brought about a decision by the mine owners to organize a lockout on the 30th of April 1926. So lockout is when you take the decision to lock down your premises, to lock down the factories so that workers cannot go to work. Okay, so it's either a lockdown or a lockout, depending on the perspective. A lockout from a worker's point of view, because the worker cannot go to work anymore. So this is the mine owners deciding that they will not allow the miners to go to work. Okay, this is called a lockout. So this was the beginning of a sort of vicious circle which led to the outbreak of the strike. There was a TUC conference on the 1st of May, which announced a general strike, and the general strike was meant to begin on the 3rd of May. On the 2nd of May, the printing industry, and more specifically the printers of the Daily Mail, refused to print an article which denounced the strike, and this was taken as a sort of pretext by the government to announce that the Trade Unions Congress, the trade unions had in fact refused to continue to negotiate with the Prime Minister, and that therefore the negotiations had been broken down by the trade unions, when in fact, to a certain extent, we could say that the decision by the mine owners to organize a lockout could be described as a provocation. Okay, but here you go. These are the events. This is the sequence of events leading up to the outbreak of the strike on the 3rd of May, 1926. So if we turn to the next slides, slides 6 and 7, I will comment on those slides together. What those slides tend to show is that on the part of the government, and in particular on the part of ministers who could be described as right-wingers within the Conservative government, One case in point here would be to mention Winston Churchill, who was a right-winger in this Conservative government. The right-wingers were able to convince the Prime Minister that the whole situation should be dramatized. And if you look at slide number 6, you can see an armored car, a photograph which represents an armored car, which was used to protect food supplies, which was used by the government to protect food convoys. Okay? So the point which I'm trying to make is that what started off as an industrial dispute, which could have been settled through negotiations between the parties involved, the mine owners, the mine workers and the trade unions, Congress, and the government. They could have tried to negotiate a settlement. Ended up in, descending into a strike which involved not only the miners, but a whole range of other industrial sectors. And the strike not only descended in the industrial dispute, not only descended into a strike or a general strike, but it was very early on presented as a sort of civil war through the use of armaments, armored cars, as you can see here. The words which were used, the rhetoric which was used, in particular by the government, who talked about organizing an army of volunteers manned by middle-class university students. This is also a very warlike vocabulary which was used in order to dramatize the situation. Okay? The army of volunteers itself was reminiscent of wartime. Remember that the First World War had ended in 1918, less than 10 years before. So the memories of the war were very vivid. And using the phrase army of volunteers, of course, brought back echoes of the war, echoes of the need to defend the nation against an enemy. Okay? So a sort of polarization and dramatization. Another example, the troops, the army, were sent in to move supplies from the London docks. So very much on the part, of course, of the government and the way the response to the general strike was managed by the government, there was a determination to dramatize the situation, to give it, of course, a warlike dimension. If we turn to slide 7, and of course, I will not be reading those texts, short excerpts from declarations by Winston Churchill or by the Prime Minister in a radio broadcast, excerpts taken from newspapers which were published at the time of the strike, the British Gazette, on the side of the government, the British Worker on the side of the trade unions movement and the strikers. But more generally, what I can say is that there was an attempt on both sides to sort of play the blame game. In other words, to name and shame those who could be described as being responsible for a general strike which threatened to bring the economy to a standstill. Okay? Simply, if you look at Churchill's words, okay, short quote, he declared, "We're at war. We must go through with it. Either we crush the strike or the strike will crush us." So this is part of what we could describe maybe as a sort of propaganda war, with each side trying to impress its or their point of view on the general public. There was this realization, of course, that a conflict was a conflict which also a conflict whose outcome also hinged on the capacity to convince the general public. So in other words, this is what I was saying before about independent reporting, what I was saying about the independence of media outlets, and what I was saying about how, of course, in the 20th century, at a time when mass politics had become a reality, an industrial dispute, a confrontation between employers and employees, or a confrontation with the government, must also bear in mind the necessity, of course, to convince a majority of the general public in order to be victorious. Okay, so I suggest that you read the various excerpts which you can find here on slide 7. And I will move on to how the strike ended, slide number 8, ending the largest industrial dispute in Britain history. So this is an important point which needs to be made, because the decision to stop the strike was interpreted in different ways. And in the same way as we could say that the decision to go on strike was a decision which was taken in a certain amount of confusion between April and May 1926, the decision to stop the strike was not as clear-cut as could have been hoped. And also, it gave birth to a particular line of interpretation, or a particular strand of interpretation, which was very, very ambivalent about the role played by the TUC. So let's look at the facts. The general strike was called off by the TUC on the 12th of May, 1926. The TUC decided that the strike should stop, and that there was only one issue to the strike, and that was through bargaining, negotiating with the government. This was a decision which was taken by the trade unions movement leadership, the TUC. Most of the trade unions accepted this decision. It was refused only by the miners, who refused to return to work until December. The question arises, what convinced the TUC that they should stop the strike after only 9 days? So you will see I've listed all the reasons that can be invoked here to try and account for the TUC's decision from the TUC's unpreparedness. This was a general strike which had not been prepared by the TUC, and the TUC was caught off guard, probably only went along with the idea of a general strike because they could not be seen to disagree with it as a result of the pressure exercised by the shop floor, as a result of the pressure exercised by the syndicalist leaders. So this was very much part of the internal dynamics of the trade unions Congress, and the leaders had to take into account a potential threat to their leadership, the threat posed by those who were influenced by the ideas of the syndicalist movement, those whose views were influenced by the Communist Party of Great Britain, etc. The TUC, nevertheless, came to realize fairly rapidly that the strike was an extremely costly one, spending in 9 days 4 million out of 12.5 million total strike fund. So obviously this was also something which weighed in the balance. And we could add that the political arm of the trade union movement, the Labour Party, those who gave political representation to working men's interests, the Labour Party, disapproved of the general strike. They were in favour of parliamentary action, not revolutionary action, but parliamentary action. So these are, of course, reasons which can explain the decision taken by the TUC to try and resume negotiations with the government and the employers as early as possible, perhaps from a position of strength also, as a result of being able to organize a strike, a sort of general strike for 9 days. The assessment of the general strike, those 9 days in May, and I'm more thinking in a long-term assessment of the general strike of 1926. So what is interesting about how this episode can be assessed is that there is a great deal of ambivalence as far as the assessment, as far as the evaluation is concerned. I would say 2 major camps. Those who will consider that this strike could be described as the 9-day wonder, okay? And I was speaking about the mythical dimension of the 1926 general strike in my introduction. For some members of the left, and this would be the case of Ken Loach, the filmmaker Ken Loach, this period, the 9-day wonder, was seen as a climax in the last period of labor militancy. Okay? Others considered that the 1926 strike was not a wonder, but that it was a failure. And that its failure, the failure to support the miners to the end, the support to show solidarity with the miners' claims and grievances to the end, this would lead to a sort of disaffection for the trade union movement. And there are those historians of the left who tend to consider, of course, that the labor movement was greatly injured by those who decided to put an end to the strike and who decided to compromise with the government and with the employers. There is a particular line of thought, a particular strand of thought, a particular interpretation on the left, which describes the TUC leaders as traitors to the cause. Okay? Conversely, there are those, let's say, those who can be found on the reformist side of the divide within the labour movement. Those who will tend to argue that the TUC leadership were right to abandon the idea of a general strike because it was meant to be a failure, and that it was important to stop before too much harm was done to the workers, to their families, and perhaps also to the trade union movement more generally. And that the 1926 general strike was not seen as the beginning, but rather as the end of a sequence. Okay? And that from then on, from 1926 onwards, the trade unions should no longer try and topple governments, should no longer try to bring the capitalist system to its knees, but on the contrary, that they should try to reform the capitalist system through parliament, and in particular through the activities of the Labour Party in parliament, and obviously also through the policies of Labour governments if Labour was ever capable of winning a general election, which they did in 1945. So this is the reformist line, which was supported by those who became the most outstanding figures of the Labour movement in the 1930s and in the 1940s. They go by the name of Walter Citrine and Ernest Bevin. Ernest Bevin, who was the leader of the TUC from the late 1920s onward, and who became a minister in the first Labour government of 1945-1951. Okay. Let me just finish by saying a few words about the echoes of the general strike, after having mentioned how the history of the general strike is a history which is still being investigated and explored, and there is still a disagreement as to how it should be interpreted. But I've given you the main lines of interpretation. I just want to say a few words to conclude about the legacies of the general strike of 1926, or more than the legacies, I would like to talk a little bit about the echoes of the 1926 general strike, which resonated in the 1970s and in the 1980s. So I will just give you a few examples of industrial disputes and major strike actions which emerged and developed in the 1970s in Britain, because you can find echoes of 1926 in those 2 decades of British history. So in the 1970s, an interesting decade from the point of view of industrial relations. Under a Conservative government elected in 1970, Conservative government of Edward Heath, until from 1970 to 1974, against a similar background of economic recession and of increased difficulties for the coal industry. We've seen that the coal industry was already declining in the 1920s. It suffered from a number of flaws. It had not been modernized in the 1920s. It was facing competition from other fuels, petrol, oil, electricity. This was already true in the 1920s, and it was all the more so in the 1970s, especially at the time of the oil crisis of 1972-1973, the winter of 1972-1973. We can say that the general situation in that period was similar, if not identical, but at least similar to the socioeconomic situation which prevailed in the early 1920s. With a one trade union, the National Union of Mine Workers, facing an opposition on the part of the government over issues which had to do with increasing wages. So the similarities are fairly striking. A government refusing to allow increased wages, okay? A trade union leadership, the leader of the National Union of Mine Workers, Arthur Scargill, who felt, of course, that his authority depended on his capacity to prove that he was able to fight for ordinary workers, that he was able to organize a fight for the rank and file, to organize a fight for the shop floor, okay? And who therefore was able to organize a wave of strikes in 1972, in 1973, in 1974, strikes which nearly brought the British economy to a standstill. The government had to declare a state of emergency in 1972. And in 1974, the Prime Minister had to impose what is known as the 3-day week, because there was not enough fuel for Britain's factories to run. So a major showdown between the Conservative government of Edward Heath and the National Union of Mine Workers, as bearing a number of resemblances with the 1926 general strike. And I want to finish with the Winter of Discontent and the miners' strike of 1984-1985. The Winter of Discontent is a particular phrase which is used to describe the events which took place in the winter of 1978-1979, when a number of public sector workers decided to go on strike over pay, over wages, asking for pay rises, okay? Hoping, of course, that they would get the same wage increases as the Ford car workers had got in the autumn of 1978. Those public sector workers were people who worked for the National Health Service as nurses, for instance, infirmiers, infirmières. They were people who work as garbage collectors, okay? And those people stopped working in the winter of 78, 79, making it possible, of course, to take scary photographs of the streets of London overflowing with uncollected garbage, taking photographs of hospitals where no one cared for those who'd been hospitalized, taking photographs or filming cemeteries where the dead had not been buried. A major strike movement, okay, which was clearly described in the press by the BBC and also by the Conservative opposition of Margaret Thatcher as incompatible with decency, with the most basic decency. This winter of discontent, known as the Winter of Discontent, and there's an article that you can read about this on Amitis, played a major role in the capacity of the future Conservative Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, to argue that the trade unions were out of control, that Labour was unable to control the trade unions and the shop floor, to argue that Britain had become ungovernable as a country, that the government no longer governed, that the street governed. And of course, this, of course, was an argument which convinced, alongside with other elements which could be found in the Conservative Party's manifesto, this convinced a majority of voters to vote for the Conservatives at the time of the June 1979 general election. So the point which I want to make, and where we can find echoes of the general strike of 1926, is that the representation of the strike in the media, of course, the representation of the strike and the strikers and the trade unionists in political speeches by major politicians, of course, can turn public opinion against those who go on strike to defend their livelihood, to improve their livelihood. But what is interesting with the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979 is that it opened the way to a much more aggressive political line against trade unionism in general, and against what we could describe as collectivism, working class solidarity, and in its place, what this conservative government, which was elected in 1979, this conservative prime minister, who was elected in 1979, was able to change the climate of opinion to promote self-help instead of solidarity, to promote home ownership instead of working class solidarity, to promote individualism instead of working class solidarity. And the final defeat of the miners who went on strike in 1926, who went on strike in 1972, 1973, and who were again on strike in 1984, 1985. This was the final defeat. It took place at the end of a 1-year-long strike between 1984 and 1985, with the defeat of the miners by this conservative prime minister. This was not only a defeat for the miners, but it was also the beginning of a new conception of trade unionism and how trade union power could be limited and controlled. So the point that I want to make to conclude is that you have this sequence of events from 1926 to 1984, 1925, with a new form of trade unionism being born out of the defeat of the National Union of Mine Workers in 1984, 1985. I will end here. I strongly recommend that you read whatever articles and links I've uploaded on Amétis, but I also strongly recommend that you don't hesitate and send any questions that you have concerning this, concerning today's lecture. And I will talk to you again in 2 weeks' time.